this next session, you'll see Michael Cockerell being interviewed by Sir Richard Ottaway. If you enjoy the session, take a selfie and share your digital festival experience on our Facebook, Twitter or Instagram accounts to encourage your friends to join in too. So now, please give a virtual welcome to Michael Cockerell.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this session of the Isle of Wight Literary Festival. Our guest author this afternoon is Michael Cockerell, whose book entitled Unmasking Our Leaders is something he's going to talk about. He's a celebrated political documentary maker with a string of awards to his name. He's interviewed every Prime Minister from Harold Wilson to Boris Johnson and a number of key figures in our political history. The book is full of stories of a clash between principles and power, loyalty and intrigue. In fact, Rory Bremner rather cleverly described him as the David Attenborough of the political animal kingdom. Michael Cockerell, welcome to the Isle of Wight Literary Festival.
Thank you. I wish I was in the Isle of Wight to be sharing it with you.
Well, so do I. But Michael, I mean, you've had a long career making political documentaries. How did you get into them in the first place?
In the very first place, it's to do with the fascination I developed in an early age with politics, and that what you were talking about, the clash between personality and power and principles. And at school, at grammar school in London, I had the classic inspirational history master who fired up my interest in not only in politics, but in history and how politics is written about and how history comes about. And I got into Oxford, and on my first day in Oxford, it was 1959, the day that the Conservatives won by a landslide under Harold Macmillan, the general election. And I remember going to the Freshers' Fair, and there were the Conservatives, often sort of blonde haired, floppy haired young men, celebrating the great victory with a blackboard. They were chalking the results up on. And then I saw the Labour Club, and they advertised their first meeting, which said, Labour, psychologically happier in opposition, ? And I thought, this is an interesting place. And the first weekend, a young new MP who just won North Devon, called Jeremy Thorpe, came down and talked, and he was an amazing speaker at the Union, very funny and clever. And the following week, Harold Macmillan himself came down, and he'd been at Eton and Balliol, and was in the First World War, at the Battle of the Somme, and was severely injured in the Battle of the Somme. And at the end of the war, he said that of his 20 contemporaries who were reading classics with him, 19 of them died in that First World War. And he was so moving and such an attractive figure that these are the people I want to follow somehow as a journalist or a television journalist. It's still early days for being a television reporter, so that's how I started.
And of course, that experience he had on the Somme made him passionate about European unity, which is a strand which goes through the whole of all the leaders that you interviewed. But the first person that you really got to know was Harold Wilson. How did that come about? How did you find him as a person?
Yeah, the first job I got when I came down from Oxford was working at a company that produced digests of international labour parties all around the world, and I was to read newspapers in various languages, some of which I understood and some of which I didn't, but I could work out if it was in Roman script. I could work out what they'd said, and I would send them to be translated, and choose I would choose the most interesting articles for this organisation of Labour parties of the world, which was called the very Trotskyist sounding Socialist International. But actually, it was people like François Mitterrand, Harold Wilson, Willy Brandt, and I would go to the conferences and meet all these famous political leaders. And that's when I first met Harold Wilson. And then just after that, he became leader of the Labour Party and then Prime Minister. And I followed him I then joined the BBC and followed him making, first of all, radio programs and then films about Harold Wilson. He was a fascinating character. He was the first politician who really understood how television worked.
Yeah.
And he had, as his sort of effectively his spin doctor, his notorious secretary, who was called Marcia Williams, who understood more about television and how it worked than anyone I've ever met. She said to me that when they first did a party political broadcast, Harold Wilson talked to the public and saying what he was going to do and saying it with his fist like that. And she said, it just looked so aggressive to when he was making his points and the fist coming out, that we had to do something about him. So that's why she said we gave him his pipe to smoke. And it also showed his wedding ring, and that was a good sign but for him, because he showed he was married, whereas Ted Heath wasn't.
Because ironically, despite his understanding of television, he did badly in the 1970 debate and lost to Ted Heath, who was campaigning as Ted Heath, a man to trust. Did you cover that election?
I did indeed, yeah. I filmed with Harold Wilson and a bit with Ted Heath, which everyone thought he was going to lose the election, but he didn't. And Ted Heath had a completely different attitude to television from Harold Wilson. And over the years, I interviewed him a number of times, and he had an interesting black sense of humor. I remember he said to me before one big interview I did with him, he said, "Oh, do you have any training for this sort of thing?" And I said, no, not at all. I mean, I don't do any research. I don't read any books or see any previous interviews, anything.
Very, very Ted, if I may say. One thing. Sorry, I just say one thing you touch on in the book is that sexuality isn't far beneath the surface in number 10, and you touch
not
on
only in number 10, across Westminster and Whitehall to a certain extent.
Perish the thought, but just sticking with Ted for a moment, you talk about the fact that he did have some affection for a girl, and then Tufton Beamish tried to find him a wife. Yes,
Sir Tufton Beamish, what a wonderful name. He was one of the famous Tory Knights of the Shires, and he felt that Ted for a long time was losing popularity because he wasn't married, and he took it upon himself to try and find a wife for Ted Heath, and he knew that he got on very well with the concert pianist Maura Limpany, and he went to see Maura Limpany and said, "Look, Ted's got to have a wife. You get on very well. I'd like you to marry Ted." And Maura Limpany said, "Well, I like Ted very much, and we're both musicians and so on, but I'm in love with someone else." But it was extraordinary, the backbencher, Sir Tufton Beamish, going over to try and find a wife for Ted. And I asked Ted about this. And I said, "Did you know about that?" And he said, "No." And I said, "Well, what do you think about it?" Nothing surprises me these days.
Do tell us a very interesting story, which I had never heard before. That a good friend of his was Colonel Ian Harvey, who was a homosexual. And he had Ted on his bookcase had Colonel Harvey's book, to which had been inscribed on the inside, "To Ted, who knows what it's like." What do you think was behind that anecdote?
It's an extraordinary story. Just about Colonel Harvey. It was a great scandal in the 50s when he was found in flagrante in the bushes by in the Knightsbridge barracks. It was December, and he was with a young guardsman in the bushes, and he was disgraced and had to resign as an MP. And Winston Churchill at the time said, "In the bushes with a guardsman, coldest night of the year, makes you proud to be British."
Very.
Ian Harvey wrote a book about his fall from grace called "To Fall Like Lucifer," and when the Heath's researchers who were helping him write his memoirs, and it took him many years to write his memoirs, one of them told me he saw the book on Heath's bookshelf and found that dedication saying to Ted, who knows what it's like. And they were at that very stage, they were talking about Ted Heath's time as chief whip. And one of the things that the chief whip, and Ted Heath was chief whip at the time, had to do was to deal with scandals in the Tory party. They talked to Ted Heath about this time, and the next day when they came in, the book with the inscription on had gone. They don't know where it went. Quite interesting.
Extraordinary story. Of course, Ted's great rival inside the Tory party was Enoch Powell, and I know you had a chance to talk to him. Did you ever interview Enoch around the time of the Rivers of Blood speech?
I didn't at the time of the Rivers of Blood speech. No, I interviewed him fairly soon thereafter, and I a number of times filmed with Enoch Powell, and I also made a profile of Enoch Powell called Odd Man Out. He said to me, I was talking to him about it, and he said, "I never played the game of snakes and ladders in politics. I was like the man who wasn't playing the game. I was the odd man out." He was a very extraordinary figure. I asked him about the fact that during the war, he'd ended the war. He was the first guy in the war, and the only two in the war who started off as a private soldier and ended up as a brigadier. And he ended the war, posted to India, and he said that he went to bed at night in Delhi. And when he woke up, I found I'd fallen in love with India. A remarkable thing, the Anglo-Indian relations. I found it. And I said, how come you felt that strength of feeling for India, yet when you made the Rivers of Blood speech, you were targeted as a racist? He said, "India is India, England is England. Indians in their own country are perfect, but not in our country."
Yeah.
Indeed, he was. He was also absolutely fascinating to negotiate with, because he believed in monetarism. He believed he should always negotiate his own fees. He should make the practice of monetarism work in his own case. And I remember once I was going to do an interview with him about Michael Foot, when Michael Foot became leader, was about to become leader of the Labour Party. And surprisingly, Michael Foot and Enoch Powell were on the same side on a number of things. they were both anti-European. They were both surprisingly unilateral nuclear disarmers, partly because Michael Foot wanted to get rid of the nuclear weapons altogether, and Enoch Powell didn't believe the Russians were a threat. And they also were on the same side for reforming the House of Lords, because Enoch only wanted a hereditary House of Lords, and Michael Foot wanted to pull the whole place down. And so I said to Enoch Powell, I'd like to do an interview with you on your relationship with Michael Foot, apart from anything else. This would be leader of the Labour Party. And he said, I will agree to do the interview, but there is another subject that we haven't covered. And I said, what's that? And he said, money, voodoo, the filthy lucre. I said, Mr. Powell, I'm not entitled to negotiate fees. He said, I'm aware of the conventions that subsist within your organisation, but I believe you could have an input. I said, okay. He spoke almost in Latin. I said, so what are we talking about? He said, Enoch Powell on Michael Foot, on the day that the latter is about to become the leader of his own party, must be worth 100 guineas of anyone's money.
Well, Enoch, of course, had a part in Ted's downfall as Prime Minister by leaving the Tory party in '74. Harold Wilson returned to office, who was quite quickly then replaced by Jim Callaghan, who, of course, was the only Prime Minister to hold all four top offices of state, indeed the only person at all in history. How did you find Callaghan?
I found, well, I'll just tell one story about when I first dealt with Jim Callaghan. It was in the early 1970s, and he was Shadow Foreign Secretary, and I wanted to get an interview with him for a program, and he said that he wasn't prepared to do it, but he would get his deputy to do it. And I said, well, it's very kind of you, but I have another person in mind that if you want to, I'd much prefer to have you, but I'll go to the other person. And he said, Mr. Cockerell, I think you're quite new in your career as a television producer. I want you to have my deputy. I've briefed him about this, and if you don't take my deputy, I know some very important people, and I don't think your career in the BBC will go very far. I said, Mr. Callaghan, you were threatening me. And interestingly, years later, when he agreed for me to make a film about him as Prime Minister, I reminded him of this. And I said, you were a bully, weren't you? He said, you got it wrong. I only bully people who are my own size. No, I would never bully people who a person is very. I said, but I wasn't your own side. I was, I was a young TV reporter producer, and you'd held 3 of the great officers of state at that time. And he said, but you went to university, didn't you? I never did. And he never forgot that he left school at 16, and he often thought that people were looking down on him, even when he was Prime Minister, because he hadn't gone to university.
Of course, he was quite a visionary. I mean, I think it was in an interview with you that he saw the sea change coming. He said it comes once every 30 years.
Exactly.
And of course, that ushered in Margaret Thatcher.
Absolutely. He saw what he called absolutely a sea change. He, at first, he was very scornful of Margaret Thatcher. And at Prime Minister's questions, he would call her little lady and things like that. But he realised that she was a force of nature.
Of course, Margaret wasn't expected to come leader of the Tory party and wasn't really expected to win the general election, but she did. And I think you interviewed her the day she became the leader of the opposition and became leader of the Tory party.
That's right. Yes, I made
what was your overwhelming impression then?
It was twofold, really. One was when it was announced that she'd won this leadership election, and she was the only one of Ted Heath's cabinet who was brave enough in the first round of that leadership election to stand. All the rest of the cabinet, those of them who wanted to stand against her, remained loyal to Ted. But I thought that as she was there at the first press conference with all the flashlights and everything like that, and I remember seeing all the cameras there, and she would look, then turn slowly round. I want you each to get a good picture. And slowly round and slowly back. Now I should take a turn to right, which is appropriate. And this is just become leader. I thought, this is someone who's already quite savvy about how all this works. And I said to her, what did you feel when they told you that you become the leader? And she said, well, when they told me, just thought of all my predecessors in this job, and Disraeli and Churchill, Harold Whitman, Ted Heath, and we wept. In fact, I did weep, and tears came into her eyes, and I thought, God's first interview with you Tory leader, and I made her cry.
Mm. I remember you famously said that she flirted with you on screen, but attacked you in the Commons. Is that right?
Well, 1979 election. Mrs. Thatcher's spin doctors were having troubles with her image, and she'd been leader for 4 years, and she was very off-putting to a whole range of people, apparently. And she was seen as harsh and uncaring, and it was her voice that they were concerned about, and they sent her to the National Theatre and talked to Laurence Olivier's voice coach. They voice coached Laurence Olivier to take his voice down an octave because he was playing Othello, and they said to Mrs. Thatcher, you should repeat. Your problem is that you talk from the front of your mouth and it's very high. And if we can get you to talk from your throat, it'll be much, much better. And to do that, you have to have an exercise every day where you say 100 times a day, because that comes from the back of your throat. And I was doing an interview during that 79 election, and she was speaking to me in this new, husky, fresh voice. And I said to her, I've been following you during this career, during this election campaign, and I sometimes feel there are two Mrs. Thatchers. There's the one on the conference platform full of passionate rhetoric, and then there's the one on the factory floor and in the high street, endlessly interested in the minutiae of people's lives. How many Mrs. Thatchers are there? And she said, 3 at least. I said, what are the 3? And she said it in this new voice. She said, there's the intellectual one, there's the intuitive one, and there's the one at home. And she said it in such a sort of seductive way that Robin Blair, the famous interviewer, who was watching in the studio of this interview, went out, said, the untold story of the election campaign. Margaret Thatcher is having an affair with Michael Cockerell.
Hey ho.
Flash forward, in answer to your question, flash forward 3 years to the Falklands, and I made a film because I discovered after the Argentinians had invaded that there were a number of conservative backbenchers and even a couple of cabinet ministers who had grave doubts about sending the task force 800 miles down to the South Atlantic, although most of them wouldn't say. I mean, I don't know what your own position on that was. I'll be interested to hear this in a second, but I'll just tell you that we did find 2 or 3 Conservative MPs who agreed to come on and talk about their doubts. And there was a big attack on the programme afterwards. And Mrs. Thatcher was asked in the House by another Conservative backbench MP, Mrs. Sally Oppenheim, will the Prime Minister take time off in the course of her busy day to watch a recording of last night's Panorama in which Michael Cockerell dishonoured the right of freedom of speech in this country? And Mrs. Thatcher said that she agreed, and that there were some people in this country who didn't understand their duty to stand up for our boys. I thought my duty in the war was to do as best I could without giving away any state secrets, to tell the truth of what was going on. What was your own view of the whole expedition?
Mine, well, actually, I was swept into the House of Commons on the subsequent election, but it was. I mean, she did the right thing, and I'm sure most of Britain was behind her. But as you say, in fact, I think you were portrayed as a traitor as a result of all this.
Yes, absolutely. What was it? There was a cartoon. This was for Panorama, did it? The Daily Express called it Traitorama, and had a picture of me and various Nazi soldiers. And the Guardian had a cartoon which showed the newsreader, and the newsreader turned up with Mrs. Thatcher, and she said, "Here's the news, there's been a takeover of the BBC." And that was Mrs. Thatcher. So it was quite a tough time at that time.
She was, of course, like so many Tory leaders, troubled all the way through by Europe, which ultimately led to her downfall. When she became leader of the opposition, she was actually she campaigned for our membership during the Harold Wilson referendum, but she slowly started to turn against Europe, and of course fell out with Nigel Lawson and Geoffrey Howe. How did you see that era and her removal from office?
Yeah, well, how long ago? But she did. Europe. I filmed with her in 1975 during that referendum, and she said that she totally believed in Europe, and this would be a once in a lifetime referendum. But once she became Prime Minister, she became less and less enamoured with the EU, and then became thoroughly a Eurosceptic. But I think after the Chancellor and the Foreign Secretary had kind of ganged up against her, you could see that the writing was on the wall, especially when Geoffrey Howe made that extraordinary speech. Geoffrey Howe, who Dennis Healy had said about him being attacked by Geoffrey Howe was like being savaged by a dead sheep. He was a live tiger who attacked her, and Tory MPs, a lot of them were stayed supporting her nearly to the end, but her time was gone. It kind of felt like it. I remember the last interview I did with her after she'd been power for 10 years, and done an interview with her Deputy Prime Minister, Willie Whitelaw, and I said to Willie, how long do you expect Mr. Thatcher to stay in office? And Willie said, oh, for a long time. I hope she'll be there for a very long time. She's very fit and very strong. I said, but she's not immortal. And he said, no, not immortal, but perhaps she is. And the next day I was interviewing her in Number 10 for a film about Willie Whitelaw. And I said what Willie had said. And it's quite interesting. If you look at the film now and we stop it, and I told her what Willie Whitelaw had said when I said, and Willie said, she's not immortal. You stop the film at that moment, a look comes into her eye of sort of panic or intimation of mortality. But when I said, and he said, not immortal, but perhaps she is. She moved on and said, what is there? No, I am not immortal. And I don't know how long I will go on, and no one can know. It was, for her, a very bloody coup that was carried out against
Yes.
her, I think.
Yes. During her term of office, I think it was in her second term, you made a documentary entitled Maggie's Militant Tendency, which you suggested that some Conservative MPs actually had origins on the far right of British politics, and their views echoed the National Front. This ultimately ended up in a court action. What's your reflection on that episode 20 years later? Do you regret making that documentary?
I didn't say origins in the National Front. I did say some of them had associations with groups on the far right, and they were on a mailing list of a far right organisation called Tory Action, and I was careful how I phrased it, but they felt that I said exactly what you had said, which I don't believe I said. And it looked as if the BBC had a big investigation into it, and we showed all our sources. It looked as if it might be settled and not go to the libel courts, but suddenly the billionaire grocer, Sir James Goldsmith, decided to fund anyone who was in conflict with the BBC, and so the attempts to reach a settlement at the gates of the court failed. And after a few days, and the chairman of the BBC, who had been totally supportive of the programme, had died, and a new chairman had come in, and he came from newspapers, and newspapers like to settle things without him going to court. And so within 3 days, the BBC pulled the plug on us.
Oh, well. Of course, Margaret was replaced by John Major, who perhaps is rather the unexpected leader. And I think he said to you that on Black Wednesday, he was expecting the Germans and Chancellor Kohl to prop up the pound. If he'd had, I think history may have been very different. But how did you get on with John Major?
Yeah, I mean, John Major felt desperately let down by the German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, as the pound was tanking on Black Wednesday. He wanted to. He rang up the German Chancellor, who'd been on very good terms with, to get him to intervene to sort of help Sterling, but somehow the German Chancellor never returned John Major's call, and he felt rather betrayed by that. I found John Major had an interestingly dry sense of humour, which one probably didn't give him credit for. I remember at one Conservative council, not the conference, but the spring council, he said, I regard it as a travesty that a number of people leave school at the age of 16, functionally illiterate. They can neither read nor write. What is to become of them? They can't all become Prime Minister. I thought that was a good John Major line. And at the Tory Party conference that year, he said, last week on this platform, Tony Blair said his three priorities were education, education, education. Well, they are my three priorities, but not necessarily in that order.
Well, time is against us, as I could easily dwell on John Major, but as you say, he was replaced by Tony Blair. When you first met Tony Blair, it was at the Beaconsfield by-election when he was just the Labour candidate and was soundly beaten, and you thought he had no future in politics. Obviously, you had to revise that opinion. How did you get on with Tony Blair?
Yeah, when I first met Tony Blair, he was standing in the 1982 Beaconsfield by-election, which was during the Falklands, just when things were getting better for the British troops, and the leader of the Conservative campaign against Tony Blair in that election said, we don't really need to do any canvassing. The Ministry of Defence is doing it for us. And I remember when I first saw Tony Blair with this huge multi-tooth grin, obviously a public school boy. I wrote in my film the Labour Party candidate, Tony Blair, looks like exactly the kind of young man that the matrons of Beaconsfield would like to see escorting their daughters to the Conservative ball. And I thought there was never going to be anything much in the Labour Party. But I got that wrong. It's interesting, we filmed him in Beaconsfield where Gray had written his famous elegy, and I said to Blair, he said, why have you filmed Gray's elegy? And I said, well, in the elegy, I thought there was a line which summed up your chances in the election, which was, full many a flower is born to blush unseen and waste its sweetness on the desert air. And I thought that summed up your chances in the election. He said, I learned from that never to be filmed in front of a graveyard. That was a Tony Blair misremembering, because is that your dog?
No, it is my dog. I think my wife is leaping on it as I speak.
I thought he liked the joke.
But Tony Blair really came unstuck over the Iraq War in the end. And I think he said to you once that he was prepared to pay the blood price demanded by President Bush. That was quite a strong line to take.
Absolutely. It was, I put to him, it was when Number 10 were saying no decisions about Iraq have been taken, no decisions have been taken. And I put to him what an American Secretary of State for Defense had said, Robert McNamara, in terms of the special relationship. What the Americans want from the Brits is, are they going to be there? Are they going to commit? Are they prepared to pay the blood price? And Blair said that's exactly right. They don't just want warm words of support. When the shooting starts, they want to know that you will be there. And I remember leaving that meeting thinking within a few months we'll be at war, and that was right. There's also one thing about that. I also remember that when during the Beaconsfield by-election, when Tony Blair lost by a landslide, he had later on told Robin Cook, the former Labour Foreign Secretary, told me, and said the lesson that he drew from Beaconsfield was wars can make prime ministers popular, interesting.
Boris Johnson, probably one of the more charismatic figures to occupy number 10 and who you've interviewed. And he admitted he had doubts about his ability to be prime minister to you.
Yeah, that's very interesting to ask that, because over the years I've asked a number of prime ministers this question. Do you have any doubts about your ability to fulfill the role of prime minister? And Tony Blair, Ted Heath said, no, why should I? And David Cameron said, if I had any doubts, I would just look for a leader of the Tory party. But when I put it to Boris Johnson, he said, well, of course one has doubts. And there would be something seriously awry if he didn't have doubts and uncertainties. And I have my own doubts and uncertainties. It's a very hard job, very tough job being Prime Minister. But if the ball were to come loose from the back of the scrum, it would be great to have a go at it. But he'd admitted to his doubts and insecurities about becoming Prime Minister.
He becomes leader of the Tory party in a very controversial way. I mean, Theresa May probably feels that she was let down by him. But looking back at his career and his time in office, I mean, he was sacked from the Times for dishonesty. He was sacked by Michael Howard from the Tory front bench for misleading him. Conrad Black, as you quote in the book, says Johnson is a sly fox disguised as a teddy bear. And Rory Stewart says he's the most accomplished liar in public life. With your perception of our leaders, what sort of person do you really think he is? Is he the hypocrite that Cummings says he is, or is he a straight sort of guy?
I don't think anyone would ever accuse Boris of being a straight sort of guy. Straight as a corkscrew, isn't it? He doesn't really know quite who he is a lot of the time. And Dominic Cummings said, that he's always wearing a mask, and beneath the mask is another mask. And that mask prevents him really defining what he is. What he is someone who has an extraordinary gift for being liked. You can be filming with Boris Johnson, and often in very kind of unconservative areas, as it used to be the case. And people say, Bojo, can have a selfie and all that. He within seconds of walking down the street to him, hundreds of people, lots of people want to have the selfies with him. He's very good at that. But beneath that, there is a kind of calculation that goes on. A calculation often about what to say, which will either get the best laugh or will be ridiculous. He sometimes, though, feels very insecure. Against that, there's this extraordinary, almost gorilla-like figure. I've played tennis with him. He plays, oddly enough, with a warped wooden racket, which must have been old when Fred Perry was done. But it had the advantage, it's so warped that the ball goes off in all directions, rather than unexpected directions, rather like with Boris himself. And when the ball comes, he leaps in the air like a gorilla and grunts, that's mine. He's a very interesting figure.
I mean, it's Enoch Powell who said all political careers end in failure. You put it another way in the book. You said quite frequently, what starts with cheers almost invariably ends with tears. Do you think Boris Johnson's premiership is going to end in tears?
And when? It's and how? It's a. There's scarcely. I mean, Mrs. Thatcher, for instance, Charles Powell said to me about Mrs. Thatcher, I don't think she ever had another happy day in her life since she stopped being Prime Minister. I think it almost always ends in tears, but what the tears will be with Boris, it's very difficult to say, because if you think of Boris on the zip wire, it's an analogy, but he was stuck on the zip wire, and David Cameron said, for any other politician that would look being stuck on the zip wire holding 2 Union Jacks, saying get me a ladder, that would be disastrous. But for Boris, it'll be a triumph. He defies all forms of gravity. I think that's right with Boris. When he was at Eton, he used to be in the school play, and he would never learn his lines, and the play would turn into a hilarious exchange of him and the prompter. And I said to him, is that a lesson that began for life, that you could get more laughs by not knowing your lines than by knowing them? Well, Michael, if what you're saying is that I sometimes might give the impression that I don't quite know what's going on, well, actually, maybe that I don't know, but it gives me time to think of what was going on. So he sort of knows that he plays this game of pretending he doesn't know what's going on in order to give himself time to find out what is going on.
Well, we shall see. Michael, I mean, we've covered quite a lot of the piece here. You've had a long career in journalism and documentary making. I, during my time in politics, was always very conscious of the constant tension between journalists, reporters, documentary makers, and politicians. Yet you seem to somehow straddle that divide, and seem, indeed, I sense that quite a few politicians have become your friends. Whereas most politicians have got few friends who are journalists. What do you put it down to? Do you actually like politicians, or do you respect them? And why is there this tension between politicians and journalists?
2 parts of the question. Answer the last one, because what the tension is inherent and it's built in, because politicians and journalists are doing very different jobs. In some sense, and this is a rough way of putting it, in some sense, most politicians spend their life trying to paint a golden picture of what's going on, and in denial about what is really going on. Whereas most journalists spend their life, if they can, trying to find out what the truth of what is going on is. And that's part of the thing. And most journalists are themselves skeptical, if not cynical, about what's going on. So we both have different roles and different ways of approaching it. In terms of myself, I suppose the main reason, I hope, is that okay. Let me give you Peter Madison. Very few people would ever quote Peter Madison in their age, but he once he once glid up to me at a party and said, "You do the most important thing that's possible to do for a politician." I said, "What's that, Peter?" He said, "You make them appear human," and then glid away, just as I'm about to say, might be difficult to do, Peter, leaving only the faintest whiff of sulphur, but in a way that that make them appear human. That's a spin doctor's take. I try to bring out the human side of politicians, which is often disguised by two men in suits sort of shouting at each other. And I try to find out what they're really like and what motivates them. And I do it with an amount of sympathy, because I do think that politicians have a terrible job to do most of the time, and they're given a pretty much a beating a lot of time, even more so with social media. So I'm sympathetic, and I do have friends who are politicians, but I try never to pull my punches, but I try to give them a chance to tell me what it was all about, what it really felt like. And most of them seem to think that the program I've made about them is all right. So Dennis Healy, for instance, I was asked to make an obituary of him. I'd made a couple of programs about him before, and he rang me up. I rang him up. I didn't want to say that I was making an obituary, and I said they're thinking of running that film I made about you again, but updated. So I wondered if you'd do an interview. He said, "Do you mean you're making my obituary?" I said, "You got it in one." And when we finished making that, he did what no one's ever done before. Asked if he could see his own obituary, and I talked to the high-ups in the BBC about it, and they said, "Well, why not? As long as it's only he sees it." And we sent him his obituary, and I talked to his daughter who'd helped us. I said, has he watched the film? And she said, he watched it, and then when it finished, he played it straight through again. And I thought that was wonderful that he's seen his obituary and wanted to watch it again. And when we finished filming that day, he was 94 or something like that, still in very good shape. We filmed with him all day, and he said, "Right, you sod off." And I'm nod off.
Well, on that cheerful note, Michael, sadly must bring it to an end, but it's wonderful you should end on a story of which there are so many in this brilliant book. It's a thoroughly enjoyable book, but for those of us who are interested in politics, it's unmissable and compelling. Michael Cockerell, thank you very much indeed for appearing at the Isle of Wight Literary Festival.
Thank you very much. I've greatly enjoyed it, and thanks for the wonderful questions.
Thank you very much for participating in the Isle of Wight Literary Festival. If you've enjoyed this presentation, please consider making a donation. Follow the Donate Now button from the homepage of our website. You can also benefit from great discounts by ordering via Blackwell's bookshop from our homepage. We'd like to thank the loyal sponsors and supporters who've sustained the Isle of Wight Literary Festival over the past years. Without their financial contribution, it will be difficult to attract the many wonderful speakers we've hosted, while keeping ticket prices down. This year, their support has enabled us to provide the digital festival free of charge.